Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to do our Should You Buy video on the RSI Antares. Now, if you haven't seen the new ship that went straight to flight ready, the Antares is a variant of the popular Scorpius or the two-man X-Wing gunship that's in the game, but instead of the Scorpius's intentions of overwhelming firepower, the Antares aims to lock down and disable ships through the usage of an EMP generator and a quantum jammer, all somehow crammed into this hole along the spine of the ship. Now, for this video, I did intend to do this with game testing involved since it was straight to flight ready. However, if you've been following the release of 3.18, things are a little bit complicated at the moment, so while I did have a little bit of time in Arena Commander with the ship, that was about it. That being said, we do know a lot about the ship. We already had a Q&A, and there's some stats on it since Urkel is so good about keeping things up to date, so this should be good information regardless. The Antares is still a two-man ship, but to make room for the additional equipment on board, this unique hull variant loses the turret that makes the Scorpius so dangerous and replaces those with two separate generators along with an additional power plant to help support them. That together makes the Antares dangerous, but in a less direct way than the Scorpius. Now, aside from the changes already mentioned, things are pretty similar between the Antares and the Scorpius. Both are 24 meters long, 32 meters wide, 13 meters tall, with the long wings being the dominant axis of size. Just like the Scorpius, the Antares has 4 size 3 repeaters on the wings and 16 size 2 missiles in the hull, which honestly is a pretty good weapon loadout even when you consider you're bringing along an EMP to the fight and losing the turret. That being said, in order to leverage and utilize the EMP and the quantum jammer, you need to have a co-pilot that sits in the back and today is responsible for just arming, charging, and firing 2 different options. That's worth mentioning for a few reasons, because in order to maximize what this ship can do, you essentially have a player doing a very boring task, just going along for the ride, which has almost become the greatest series of memes that I've seen on Reddit, because the idea of a player spending their time doing it is almost laughable. Now, I'm assuming at some point you're going to be able to hire an NPC to be able to manage the EMP and the jammer at some point, but that will take planning, coordination, and expense as well. So how many people are going to opt to use this craft versus something like an Avenger Warlock or a Sentinel that don't require you to have that second person is a big TBD. I think we also go back to the old question of if it's 2 people, is that better in one ship versus bringing 2 separate ships discussion? And where things stood originally, multiple ships was always favored, but with the changes to turrets and capacitor implementation, it almost always favored turrets and multi-crew. But now, this is a different animal altogether. Is having an Antares fully crewed better than bringing something like a Warlock and another fighter? From an EMP and fighting perspective, I'd say no. The multiple ships with more weapons is a better option since the Antares co-pilot only has those controls and no guns. But then you're also having to consider that the Antares does something that the Warlock doesn't, which is locking down quantum travel, forcing your target to either fight or flee and hope to break out of the range and be able to jump away. That right there is the real differentiator of the Antares. You prevent them from leaving. Then you disable their ship, which means that this is a ship designed to set the table for boarding parties. In the future, we may see that the second seat is able to do more and have more dynamic functions with radar, and that may change the story here a little bit. But even in today's world, they can help with managing shields and power, so it's not quite as worthless as it may seem at face value. So let's talk about a few other things with the ship, then we can dive into the numbers a bit on the EMP and the dampener. Both the Antares and the Scorpius share the same armor and shields, so durability between them is identical currently, and that is validated with Urkel data. That being said, you would assume that the current turret being scrapped would mean that there's a less total HP pool than on the Antares, but then again, those components are going to come with some level of HP included, so it's got to even out to some degree, and at the end of the day, with things like soft death and more accurate damage models, that doesn't really matter that much going forward. What does matter though is apparently the turret is heavier than the quantum dampener and the EMP combined, so the Antares is going to be 20 meters per second faster and a little bit more agile than the more weapons forward Scorpius. It already has been determined that these are different hull variants to be able to equip the turret or the generators, So there is no swapping between these options planned for the future. So you either have one or the other. There is a drawback to these power-hungry weapon systems on the Antares, though, which is that you're going to have a significant radar signature and will be picked up from further away than you would carrying traditional weaponry on the turret. So let's look a little bit closer at the current state of the equipment, which again is leveraging data found from Urkel. The quantum dampener used on the Antares is known as the Tide Lock, and while I expect more balancing in the future, it currently shares the same jamming range as both the Mantis and the Blue, which is 2 kilometers. Now, in earlier patches, it felt like the Mantis had a significantly larger range on the jammer than the Blue, with only 2 kilometers. But it would appear that most of those numbers have been normalized, potentially going back to when all the weapons and components were normalized. So regardless of the option that you're selecting right now to try and lock down a target, they're all going to be within 2 kilometers. Now, what does make a difference here is that the Antares is currently the fastest of the 3 ships in SCM mode, and by a good margin, considering the Cuddy Blue is 198 and the Mantis is only 168. But if you consider that most of this work is going to likely be happening in space, the faster max speeds are the more relevant numbers. And there is when you see the Mantis being the fastest at 1320. And then you have the Blue and the Antares, which are both closer to 1300. What that all means in my mind is that if you're looking at the right ship to keep a target dampened and you have friends with you that will be packing more of a punch, then the Mantis is the best option as it is the fastest and has the lowest signature and is the most agile by quite a bit, meaning it's the best you have. It's the best ship of these options to kind of break away from and get outside of that 2 kilometer range. If you're looking for the ship that's just best suited to locking down a target and getting the kill out of these 3, then the Blue wins because you have more firepower. But if you look a little bit beyond the jammer, we need to talk about the EMP, and these we have more useful data on at this point. The Antares is using a new EMP called the Mag Strand generator, which shares a minimum effective range regardless of charge with the other 2 options from the Warlock and the Sentinel's generators, which is about 250 meters for all of them, which in space basically equates to nothing. The maximum effective range, though, is significantly different between the Antares, 1100 meters, the Rep VS, which is on the Sentinel, which is 900 meters, and the Rep 8 on the Warlock, 750 meters, or a total of 350 meters difference in all directions, which can be a lot of difference. The charging time on the Antares to get to a maximum is 27 seconds, which is the longest of the group, but is only differentiated by 1 second from the Sentinel. The Warlock reaches full capability in 20 seconds, which is significantly faster. However, another way using data, and this is where I like to do things, is to look at this would be to say the Antares charges 40 meters of effective range per second. It's 35 for the Sentinel and 38 for the Warlock. But you may also want to use this EMP multiple times in a fight, and that's when things like cooldown come into the picture, and here we have the Antares and the Warlock cooling down after 22 seconds, while the Sentinel takes 40 seconds. All of that is to say that the Antares is your best bet for range and timing when it comes to the EMPs, because you may take longer to get the full range on the Antares, but since you're charging at a faster rate and the capacity is higher, you'll be able to hit the Warlock's maximum range before it would be able to do so. So I look at the 2 options on the Antares, and I say that of the 3 ships with dampeners, it's the worst of the bunch. However, when it comes to the EMP, it's actually the best of the bunch that shares the larger EMPs. We're not talking about the Raven or the Hawk, for example. And the most important note is that the Antares is the only ship to be able to bring both of those to the same fight. If you wanted to do that with 2 different ships, you would be looking at a Warlock and a Mantis or something like that. Other ships have more diversity in role and have internal living quarters and other things that kind of help to differentiate them, but the Antares is a very unique package in what it brings and what it requires to use. Other notes here are just to make sure that we're all on the same page, would be clarifying expectations that while we are talking about the Mantis in the same breath, the Mantis is the only ship with the full snare, allowing you to pull people out of quantum travel. The Antares, like all the others, is just going to be there to help you keep them from making their initial jump. When it comes to the EMP, the range is what matters, not some power output when it comes to how many ships you're able to disable. So while the larger EMP will eventually have an impact on your ability to deal with larger ships, the current state is a range calculation on effectiveness. In my mind, there's two real core areas where the Antares is an interesting option, and both involve the requirement to prevent someone from jumping away and disabling their ship beyond that, which points to mercenary or bounty hunting work that will eventually require apprehending a live criminal in some instances, or the flip side of that coin, which is piracy. For those jobs, you don't need an EMP or a dampener, but they sure as heck can help, and with the dampener being the bigger asset there. The EMP is quick, but at the same time, you could have a ship with a lot of distortion weapons that can have a similar effect overall as well. So when building your fleet for a mission, you could opt for a Mantis to lock someone down, a fighter to deal with threats, and someone else in an EMP ship or with a lot of distortion, or you could kind of do a 2-for-1 with the Antares, as it will be able to do lockdown, shutdown, and combat with the weapons and missiles. The problem in those instances is that if you're trying to do too many jobs with one ship, the Antares may be spread too thin and may chase a support ship and get too far away from the ship that you're actually trying to prevent from jumping, or not be able to get close enough as needed with the EMP because you're committing it to something else. Long story short, I would look at it as a ship that can do a lot, but if you put too many eggs in that one Antares basket, it ends up being like the old multitasking analogy that I like. There's no such thing as being a good multitasker. You're really just doing multiple things poorly at the same time. You can absolutely use this ship to kind of help facilitate boarding actions, but you need support ships to get the job done, and this isn't really going to be a one-size-fits-all option, aside from potentially 1-versus-1 situations, which frankly happens a lot more than it really should because people aren't playing in groups. So with all that in mind, should you buy the Antares? Well, at $230 standard sale price, it's on the pricier side, so you need to feel good about what it can do for you and how it provides you value in your fleet. Honestly, it depends entirely on how you think you're going about using this ship. There's a weird idea here too, though, in that there's a lot of people out there that love using the Scorpius and they run it solo, even though they're not maximizing the damage output by putting someone else in the turret. So that means that the pilot just has the missiles and the guns on the wings. 4 size 3s, which is exactly what the Antares has because it can't use the EMP or the jammer when it's flown solo. However, the Antares has an extra power plant, it has the same durability, but has more favorable speed and agility as well. And the Antares is actually $10 cheaper than the base Scorpius. So if you have no plans to have a gunner or an operator fly with you and you just want to use this as a solo craft, well, sometimes I feel there are better options. If you want the X-Wing, this would actually be the better purchase of the two from a performance output and cost perspective. From what it's actually supposed to do and how it's supposed to be used, honestly, it's kind of hard to argue with the huge caveat that you have to have someone that is committed to riding with you, otherwise there are far better options. The Cuddy Blue, the Warlock, the Mantis, the Sentinel, the Hawk, etc. They all have capabilities at the pilot's control and they can manage without that extra person. Is it better to have more options but require the additional person to manage those? That's entirely up to you and how you play, and if there's others that you have that are going to be willing and interested to sit in the back seat for some relatively boring gameplay. The ship is a good idea in theory, but is it right for you? Honestly, go ask your friends because you're going to need them. If their answer is they're not sure or they don't want to do that, and they don't want to just sit there and stare at the back of your head, pick something else that you can control the experience on as the pilot because you are never going to maximize the ability of the ship. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you guys know more about this ship and have a better idea on whether you should purchase or not. If you guys have questions, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Welcome to 318. It's a little bit of a mess, and stay tuned for a lot more coming soon. Take care.